Good morning, everyone, and a very warm welcome to this ICAS webinar, the Scottish Budget Update. For those that don't know me, my name is David Mingus and I'm Director of Practice here at ICAS, and it's my great pleasure to be hosting this webinar this morning. Well, just a week ago now, the Scottish Cabinet Finance Minister, Shona Robertson, stood up in the chamber at the Scottish Parliament down in Holyrood in Edinburgh to deliver what is her last Scottish budget before this all-important Scottish election, which is coming up in May of this year. So against a tight fiscal background, some challenging cost of living crisis, the budget was delivered. But what did it entail and what does it mean for you and your clients? Well, to help guide us through this Scottish Budget Update, I'm delighted that we're going to be welcomed by Katie Close, our Director of Tax here at ICAS. Now, Katie leads our tax team, providing strategic overview and management of the tax team. She's also Secretary to the ICAS Tax Board, working on the direction of ICAS tax policy. Katie is also Secretary to the Devolved Taxes Committee, which focuses on Scottish taxation matters and the Scottish fiscal framework. Her background is in industry, where she spent over 10 years working for large corporates in Scotland as an international tax specialist. But before I pass across to Katie, just a few housekeeping matters to remind you of. You can submit questions at any time through the Q&A facility, which is accessible at the top of your screen. Questions can be submitted anonymously, but you can also join the conversation today through the through the chat box, which is also accessible at the top of the screen. And this allows you to comment or discuss with fellow attendees on matters covered by the webinar. We are, of course, recording this webinar and we'll make it available for on-demand viewing afterwards in case you either want to refer back to it or share it with others. And copies of the slides will also be available alongside the recording on icas.com. So we look forward to receiving your questions throughout the course of the webinar, and of course we'll try to get as many of those as possible in the question and answer section towards the end of the webinar. But I know Katie's got an awful lot to get through, so without further ado, I'll just pass straight across to Katie to get into the detail of today's webinar. Katie, over to you.
Thank you, David. So waiting for the slides to show on screen. Okay. Hopefully you can see the slides now. Apologies. So this ICAS webinar, just to go through today's agenda, we're going to first look at those Scottish budget announcements that David mentioned from last week, and then we'll move on and we'll look a little bit at how the UK budget and Scotland interacts, and then follow that up with an overview of Scottish funding. Somebody just mentioned that there's no slides. Sometimes you can't see the slides because of your browser, so it might help if you exit and then rejoin. And finally we will have a Q&A at the end if we have some time. There is a lot to get through, so I'm hoping that we'll have maybe 10 minutes at the end. If you have any questions, I will try to answer them at them. So, Scottish budget. It wasn't a particularly exciting budget, I have to say. It was fairly quiet. I think that's to be expected with the upcoming elections. Just to mention as well, sorry, you'll see a poll come up. There will be a few polling questions throughout the webinar, so if you can answer those, please do. It really will help to inform ICAS and what we can offer for our members. So the only probably exciting announcement that happened in the budget really to do with tax was that unexpected announcement on council tax. But to kick off, we will look at the Scottish income tax changes. So the Scottish Government had made the promise that they would make no changes to the rates or the number of bands before this budget was announced, and they kept true to their word. So there was no changes to the rates or number of bands. But what they did announce was some small changes to do with the basic and intermediate bands. So the amount at which those will start will now increase by 7.4%, and the remaining bands are all frozen until 28-29. As you can now see on screen, the last part that I was talking about was that the majority of Scottish taxpayers pay less than their counterparts in the rest of the UK. But again, I think as part of that conversation, we should be asking ourselves, is that actually a meaningful statement? Because again, it sounds really positive, it sounds good, but we have a few slides later on where you can see this more clearly. But there is quite a big disparity. When you look at lower earners, those earning under around that 33k mark, then yes, that holds true. The majority, they're paying less tax than the rest of the UK. But once you get over that amount, the disparity widens and it's quite significant. So we will have a look at that a little bit later on. And also, I think it's important to say that the policy changes around Scottish income tax are very critical for the Scottish economy, because the Scottish budget is funded by approximately 32-33% through Scottish income tax. So any changes that are made, any decisions that are made around Scottish income tax are really critical to the Scottish economy and a wider society. So now we can see, hopefully, the Scottish income tax bands. I think you can see here how some of the changes have been made. So when we look at the basic rate, it's about £1,000 higher for the next year. And when you look at the intermediate rate, it's about £2,000 higher. And also, I think this illustrates quite well how fiscal drag is slightly more prevalent in Scotland than it is in the rest of the UK. Because obviously we have our 6 bands versus the 3 bands that you have in the rest of the UK. So it is much easier to move up those bands if you are a Scottish taxpayer. So say you are somebody who's earning around about the median rate of £40,000 in Scotland, you're going to probably quite easily slip up those bands and make it into the higher band just with small incremental changes to your salary for inflation. So I think that illustrates that quite well in this because you can see how easy it is to slip between those bands. And this slide also just shows the differences in tax that's payable between not only Scottish taxpayers year on year. You can see the £11 that I was talking about. That's an annual tax saving due to those changes to the thresholds that were announced in the budget. So you now have £11 extra in your pocket for the whole year if you earn 25k. And but you can also see that the tax difference for someone earning 25k, if you compare it to the rest of the UK, the tax saving is only about £40 per year. So it brings us back to that statement again about majority of taxpayers in Scotland paying less tax than the rest of the UK. We have to look at what actually is that amount of tax that they pay. So as the box says, we have the small differences up to, should say £40, sorry, less than the rest of the UK. And then once we get to about this £50,000 mark, that's when it becomes quite interesting because it starts to diverge more widely around there. And there is a reason for that, and it is due to the way the bands work between Scotland and the rest of the UK. So in the rest of the UK, their bands are aligned with the national insurance threshold. So and ours are not. So therefore, there's a marginal tax rate of about 50% for a taxpayer on 50k in Scotland, compared to just 28% if you are a taxpayer in England, for example. So yeah, we'll see that the differences, they increase quite widely. And also as well, this earning over 100k, often talked about, obviously. So it's a 67.5% marginal rate in Scotland, 69.5% if you include employers' national insurance, and that's only 60% in England. So now we're going to move on to the council tax. As I mentioned, this was a bit of an unexpected announcement from the Scottish budget. So it's being hailed as an introduction of a mansion tax style tax. So what they've done is they've essentially introduced a change to the council tax system. They're going to have 2 new bands from April 28. So we'll have band I for properties valued between 1 million and 2 million. and Band J for properties valued above 2 million. I think what was quite interesting about this is that there is an ongoing consultation at the moment, which is due to close on the 30th of January. So it's interesting to me that the Scottish Government would make an announcement on changes to council tax before that consultation is closed. I don't think that really does much to improve trust with external stakeholders or to demonstrate transparency, really. Something to point out, though, is although it is talked about as a mansion tax, style tax up here, in line with the changes that were announced in the UK budget in November just past, it does operate a little bit differently to that rest of UK version. So this, as we understand it, is purely a council tax change. So the money will be collected as all other council tax. It will operate in exactly the same way. For the rest of the UK, the high value surcharge that was introduced, that is collected along with council tax down in England, but the amount from the surcharge will be remitted to Treasury. So it goes to central government and not to local authorities. Another item to point out really is that these new bands, they will be based on up-to-date values for those properties only, and all the other homes are remaining on the existing valuation framework, which, as we know, has not been updated since 1991. So that, again, is another interesting point. We'll have to wait and see how that works out. It may be the case that there are some announcements from that council tax reform consultation, and we could see some announcements made on that once it's closed. And another point to make is that the council tax changes, they really are not going to generate a significant amount of revenue. As you can probably expect, this impacts a very small number of properties in Scotland. It's about 1% of households, or 11,000 properties. So the business equivalent of our council tax, we have non-domestic rates. When I mentioned earlier about how business would take the budget, the government announced these non-domestic rate changes as a generous relief package, and while I do think it acknowledges the concerns of the wider business community, I don't think the business community would really see that it goes far enough, especially when we compare it to some of the changes that were introduced by the UK government. So we are seeing some relief for businesses with the announcement of those lower non-domestic rates. So they are decreasing for the basic, intermediate and higher rate. And there's a relief package being introduced for the retail, hospitality and leisure sectors. So they will have relief for 15%, available for 3 years. Only applies to the basic or intermediate rate though. I think the retail, hospitality and leisure centres will welcome that, of course. We have been hit quite hard over the past few years. And also just to mention, there's 100% relief for those retail, hospitality and leisure sectors on the islands and in 3 designated remote places in Scotland. So it is expected to save businesses some amount of money, 864 million. And the government have been able to say that over 96% of retail, hospitality and leisure properties will pay either zero or reduced rates under this package. And we'll just have a little look at some of those other announcements that were made. So land and building transaction tax, no changes were made to the thresholds or rates. Everything is staying the same as it was previously. There is a review, though, underway, which started in 25. We've not seen the outcome of that, so awaiting. That could potentially bring some significant changes to land and building transaction tax. We'll just have to wait and see. Something to think about, though, is that when they freeze the thresholds for land and building transaction tax, it also can be impacted by fiscal drag. So we will see that impact on those property prices and the amount of tax people are paying as property prices increase just naturally through inflation. We're going to see more people paying perhaps a little bit more tax. But I would say that land and building transaction tax, it doesn't make up a critical element of the Scottish budget. It's only about 1.6% total. There was also a small announcement on COACs. This is quite a niche area, but it's to do with basically co-ownership authorised contractual schemes. That is a type of property investment vehicle. So it's fairly good news as it aligns with the rest of the UK, but there are a few other bits and pieces that are still out for consultation. so we'll see if there's any new announcements made on that. Property income, this was another slight curveball from the UK budget. So of course they announced that there would be an increase in property income, 2% increase in the rate. As it works, property income is devolved. So essentially there was very little said about this in the Scottish budget, but the legislative process, as I understand, is still underway that will allow the Scottish Government to set those rates. So we'll just have to wait and see what they decide to do with that. And then just to move on to the air departure tax, this is coming in from 27. It will replace air passenger duty, and this is a bit of a win for the Scottish Government, to be honest, because they had wanted to complete all of the devolved taxes that they had on the go at the moment before the end of this parliamentary term. And by announcing this, they have basically managed to accomplish that. But they are on a little bit of a tight time frame. They have to get some legislation passed before they shut down for the Parliament before the election. So we'll just have to wait and see what happens there. And just as a note, there's a consultation on a new Highlands and Islands exemption. It's launching at the end of this month. So if you have any interest in that sector, please keep an eye out for that. That was the sticky point with this previously, with the negotiations with the UK government. There's currently an exemption under air passenger duty, so they needed to maintain that for any devolved tax in Scotland. And of course, there's the private jet supplement, so private jets will now be taxed in Scotland. And finally, just to wrap up this section, just a little bit on those future tax strategies. So hidden in those budget announcements, it was in the website papers rather than during the speech that was given. So the government are considering what a wealth tax could look like for Scotland. So that is quite a difficult one for the Scottish Government to consider. Obviously, we have to wait and see what happens at the elections for how that may proceed. But there's only so much they can do given devolution, devolved taxes. But there definitely is a case for them to do something there around perhaps property, so probably around property is the main one. They also mentioned that they're looking to introduce carbon land tax, and there is, just for anyone's information, there is a tax strategy document that was published by the Scottish Government. It was published in December 24. It's more of a framework, though, for creating a strategy. It doesn't have sort of defined goals, but it is an interesting read if you want to have a look at what the Scottish Government are trying to focus on. And then finally, just to talk a little bit about the Scottish Fiscal Commission. They are basically our equivalent of the OBR, and they have estimated that Scottish Government income tax policy choice since devolution will raise up to an additional 1.8 billion in 26-27, compared to if we had just stayed within the UK tax policy and made the same choices. So that is obviously very positive, but I think another part of that conversation is looking at what could it have potentially been? Could it have potentially been much more than that 1.8 billion? And what could we do to increase that? Because as I mentioned before, Scottish income tax critical for the Scottish economy. So now we'll have a little look at the UK budget and Scotland. Another poll has come up. Hopefully you see that on your screen. I'm running a little bit behind time because of our technical gremlins at the beginning, but I will try to get through this as quickly as I can. So this is very high level. The UK budget, we know what sort of budget it was. It was one of the biggest tax raising budgets in the past 50 years. So we were looking at tax increases of £26 billion. But it was one that had a lot of small changes. Lots of little things were changed, adding up to that big tax bill. And in terms, before we move into the more concrete elements of how it works with the Scottish budget, I thought it'd be useful to just have a quick look at what is devolved and what is reserved in terms of taxes in Scotland. So obviously we have our fully devolved taxes, we've spoken about some of them. We have Scottish landfill tax, that's already in force. We have Scottish aggregates tax, that's coming into force in April of this year. Land and building transaction tax, the building safety levy, that one was put on hold for a little while, but as part of the budget announcement, it's now going to come into force from April 28. And then as mentioned, we have air departure tax. So those fully devolved ones are completely within the control of the Scottish Government. Then we have our partially devolved, that is the Scottish income tax. This is where the UK government has some control over it and the Scottish government has some control over it. So with income tax, what is devolved, what the Scottish government has control over is non-savings, non-dividend income. So those changes that were announced in the UK budget to do with the savings rate and to do with the dividend rate going up to 2%, those impact directly on Scottish taxpayers. But as mentioned in the past couple of slides, the property income changes, that is a matter that needs to be set out legislatively so that Scotland can take control of setting that rate. So as mentioned, Scotland, Scottish Government sets the rates and thresholds for everything except the personal allowance that is set by the UK Government every year. And something that some people don't know is that the Scottish income tax is actually collected and managed by HMRC, not by Revenue Scotland. So we pay a fee to HMRC to do this for us. And then, of course, we have the local taxes, which we have spoken about. One to point out is the visitor levy coming into force in April 26. So there are a few amendments out for that right now, which we will be looking at and responding to from an ICAS perspective. And then we have the assigned one. So the assigned tax here only applies to VAT at the moment, and it's been put on hold because it's a bit of a difficult one to map out exactly how we would allocate and identify Scottish VAT, but there is the ability there for the Scottish Government to collect basically a proportion of VAT revenues that relate to Scotland. But I don't know when we will see that ever come to fruition because, as I say, there's a bit of difficulty around how we allocate and define it. So why does this UK budget matter for Scotland? So the main reason is it directly influences Scotland's spending power. So what we want to spend on our public services, our education, our NHS, that is all really interlinked with the UK budget choices and the UK tax policy choices as well. So there's a direct impact. Anything that is not devolved, any reserve matter, will directly impact on Scottish taxpayers and Scottish businesses. But then we have those UK decisions on devolved matters, which can also impact on that. So Scottish Government is really in a bit of a tight decision making that with the UK budget. They do know there's a spending review that happens every few years. The last one happened in June 25, and at that spending review with the UK Government, the Scottish Government gets a good idea of the amount that will be in the Scottish budget. But then, of course, we have the UK budget, and there are some changes made there which can have really critical impact on how much funding Scotland will receive. And the Scottish Government really has to respond very quickly to those decisions and work out how it will impact Scottish funding and what they're going to do about it. So, and there's also, it's a bit of a seesaw because there's a lot of, we will come to this, we will have a little bit of a look at how some of the calculations work later on, but there's a lot of decisions that the UK government make that directly impact what is in our budget and can kind of take it away, and then the Scottish government has to work out how are we going to replace those funds, what are we going to do to replace it. Also, just to say that it's UK economic forecasts that influence those Scottish fundings, and the timing, obviously, as discussed, really creates a lot of uncertainty. So I think my main point that I wanted to take from this is that they're deeply interlinked, and there's a lot of risk that has to be assessed by the Scottish Government, and they have to make decisions on what to do. So it's not independent. In the UK budget that we had, we are going to go and look at the block grant a little bit later, but I just wanted to briefly look at this announcement that was made in the UK budget. So it was announced that there was an additional 820 million for Scotland. So that is split, block grant is split into two types. So we have our resource funding, that's our everyday public service funding. Then we have capital funding, that's for long-term investment, usually investment over a year. And so that 820 million was split across that, 510 for resource funding, 310 for the capital funding. So that sounds great. Obviously, we have 820 million extra, but it's actually across a number of years. So the resource funding is until 28-29, and the capital funding is spread across until 29-30. That's when the capital funding review happens. So overall, what we will see is an annual increase of 128 million each year for the next 4 years for our resource funding, and an additional 62 million per year for our capital funding over the next 5 years. So when you look at it in context of the Scottish budget, it's 60 billion per year. It's not actually a huge amount if you look at it from that point of view. And then briefly, as we all know, Scottish Government had about 150 million set aside in their budget to deal with the two-child cap on benefits. And that was removed in the UK budget, so that went back into the pot, and it was pledged for child poverty and was used that way in the budget. So now we come to Scottish funding. So we will go through, I want to say that we will go through on a high level how Scotland is funded. I'm by no means an expert on the block grant, but we will go through and have a look at how some of it works. And I've got a few examples to try and make it a bit more understandable. So how is Scotland funded? So we have the block grant. That's the main source of funding for Scotland. It comes from the UK government. It's composed, I don't want to dwell on this, it's composed of Barnett and non-Barnett funding. What we're going to talk about is Barnett funding, which is what most people talk about. But non-Barnett funding, just so you're aware, it does compose a bit of the block grant, and it is usually ring-fenced, so it's set aside for specific projects. So the block grant works, it's based on baseline funding, which is always based on the prior year, so you always start with that. And then we have the dreaded Barnett consequentials. They are basically the change to the prior year amount. And it's based on three things mainly, which are spending. So spending, public spending as decided during the spending review. Comparability. Comparability is the comparable spend per person in England on devolved services. So they look at that. And we will later have a few of those percentages so you can see what it looks like. And then finally, it's also based on population share. So population share for Scotland is about 9%. So all of those things go into making up the Barnett consequentials and changing that block grant amount year on year. And then after that's been done, we would have our block grant adjustments. There are two types of adjustments. We have our tax adjustments. Our tax adjustments are always negative because they are assuming that devolution has never happened. So, for example, Scotland has no right to any share of income tax, which is raised in England or Wales. So, of course, an amount is removed to essentially replicate that. And we retain our devolved tax revenues on the other side. We also have, just to mention, the Social Security block grant adjustments. They increase the block grant, so they are positive adjustments. And as mentioned, the tax adjustments, they assume that devolution has never happened. And essentially, it's trying to get to this answer of Scotland is neither gaining nor losing because of devolution, effectively. But there is a lot that can be done here to maximise the amount of funding that Scotland receives, because they obviously keep their devolved tax revenues, and we'll go on to it in the next couple of slides, but there are the block grant adjustments. We obviously want to minimise the amount that is removed and maximise the amount of devolved tax revenues in terms of making the most out of those tax raising measures. So the Scottish Government keeps any revenue that is raised through tax over and above what would have been raised had the tax not been devolved. And importantly, vice versa if revenues were to fall. So this is some high-level scenarios. I have got some specific ones in the next few slides with some numbers so you can kind of work it through. But just high level, if we look at the block grant and the Barnett consequentials, if the UK government, for example, were to announce additional spending in defence, defence is a reserved matter. It's administered by the UK government for the UK as a whole. So Scotland does not require any amount of budget to do that, to provide that service. So there would be no additional funds to Scotland if a change like that was announced. But we would have to look at how they had raised those additional funds, because of course they may have reduced the amount for devolved services, for devolved spending, and that would reduce the block grant to Scotland. So if we were to look at, for example, the UK government announced additional spending for the NHS in England, that is a devolved matter. There's now more money for the NHS in England, so that means there would be more money for Scotland because we would get a sort of comparable share of that for spending. It does mean that Scottish Government's funding, it does depend on how funding is allocated between UK government departments, so it's quite critical whether it's a devolved area, so something that services are provided through the Scottish Government and they're responsible for it, or if it's something that is allocated to a type of department where the UK Government is responsible for it. Things like I've mentioned, defence, treasury, those sort of areas. And then block grant adjustment. This one was actually spoken about quite a lot around about the time of the UK budget. So if, for example, the UK government announced an increase in income tax rates, which we all thought perhaps they would, but they never did, that would mean that more money would have been raised if it applied across the whole of the UK. So if devolution had never happened, then there would be more tax raised by the UK government because taxes would also have increased in Scotland. But as it stands, devolution happens, so Scottish income tax would be completely out of any raises. That would be decided by the Scottish Government, as we know. So that means that there would be an additional deduction from the block grant because the UK Government are essentially saying they were to lose out because devolution is existing. And then obviously the last part of the equation is that Scotland keeps any of its devolved tax revenues. So when you look at the how it works, you can see, for if we look at income tax, for example, you can see the actual block grant adjustment, which corresponds to income tax, devolved tax revenues in Scotland. And here are some of my more detailed examples. So this is for the Burnett consequentials UK health spending increase, which we talked about a little bit. So if we use the example of it being an increase in £10 million, health has a comparability factor of 99.5%, and Scotland therefore would receive, if we looked at the equation, 947 million for the Scottish budget. An important point to this is that even though it's been that additional amount has come into the budget because of NHS spending, healthcare funding, the Scottish Government can spend it on any devolved area that they want. It's not ring-fenced whatsoever. And then we have another example of a decrease, actually. These are less common, less publicised, but they do occur. So if there was, say, cuts to transport spending in England, if the UK government were to reduce that by £1 billion, as the example I've used here, we've got a comparability factor for transport of 95.6%. And so we would see a reduction of 91 million in that case. And negative consequentials can also occur in the example that I had spoken about earlier, where we increase spending in reserved areas if they're taking that money from those devolved areas as well. So this is taken from the Institute for Government website, and it's just to give you a little look at some of those comparability percentages, just to give you a bit more flavour of how the actual calculations work. Now, the calculations are more detailed than I've obviously gone into today, but I hope this is helpful in just sort of a high level how it works. And then we have an example for block grant adjustment for the income tax. So as I've mentioned before, income tax, it really is, it's the largest block grant adjustment, as you could probably imagine. I think I mentioned earlier that it makes up almost a third of Scottish funding. So it's really critical in terms of getting it right. So how does the block grant adjustment work? So step one, we have the initial deduction. So each year the block grant is reduced by an amount equal to what UK government would have raised from Scottish taxpayers if income tax had not been devolved, as we previously discussed. And that's calculated using forecasts which are produced by the OBR, and it's applied to Scotland's population share. And a very important point, it's applied to Scotland's tax base. So the tax base makes up part of the calculation for that initial deduction. And therefore, we really need to look at, to maximise Scottish income tax, you need to look at how tax and earnings are growing in Scotland compared with the rest of the UK. Now, historically, we have had a bit of an issue because we haven't grown as fast as the rest of the UK. But over the past 2 years, that performance gap has been closing, and we are seeing greater growth in Scotland, which is really positive in terms of maximising the possibilities of devolution and increasing Scottish funding. So the next step is the reconciliation. So once HMRC publishes the actual Scottish income tax receipts, we have a reconciliation, and that difference is then reconciled in a future Scottish budget. So I think the last reconciliation was done in August of 25, and it looked at the tax year 23-24. So we are a little bit behind in terms of when that reconciliation happens. So it will always be a few years behind, and you'll see that adjustment coming through in later budgets. So as I discussed around this tax revenue and earnings growth issue, if Scottish income tax is growing faster than the rest of the UK, basically Scotland gains, they have more funding, and if it's growing slower, then Scotland loses out. So this makes up quite a critical part of when you're thinking about Scottish income tax and you're thinking about devolved taxes in general, thinking about what's the tax base and how it works in with those calculations for the funding, for the block grant, etc. And then this is my final slide. So we have made it that we will have some time for Q&A if anyone has any questions. Don't feel pressured though. But yeah, I just wanted to discuss a little bit about the challenges ahead. So as I just mentioned in that slide before, we have had long-term issues in Scotland with low productivity, with lower earnings growth, with lower tax revenues being raised per person. And we also have an ageing population, which the Scottish Government knows is an issue. It will be a challenge to meet. So essentially, we're saying that we're going to have more need for healthcare for the ageing population. It's going to potentially be more expensive to meet the needs of that ageing population. And then conversely, we're going to have a smaller population of working age people. Apologies. So that means that we have this bigger bill for healthcare, but we have fewer people to actually raise those taxes from. And as I had discussed previously, the income tax in particular is really critical to Scotland's funding. So that is definitely a challenge that the Scottish Government is going to have to address. How are they going to meet those revenues that they need? And that brings me on to my second point, which is estimated that at this point in time, in the next 3 years, we will have nearly a £5 billion funding gap between public service spending and the funding that we have. So again, Scottish Government have mentioned it, and they need to really address it. So as well, just a comment on the uncertainty of all of that. The documents produced by the Scottish Government perhaps don't take the most long-term planning view of Scottish taxes, but I would say that it's critical to have a view like that. If we look at countries like Ireland, like New Zealand, they had produced very long-term fiscal strategies looking at the challenges that I've described to do with ageing populations, how they'll raise tax revenues in future. They've looked at periods of time for 40, maybe 35 years and trying to anticipate how will we meet those demands. And I think the Scottish Government could well do with having something similar. It would be very helpful to meeting the challenges for Scottish taxation. So I think that is me. So we will now move on to the Q&A. And if anybody does have any questions, we can now try to answer them. Just going to have a look and see if anybody happens to have written anything.
No particular
No.
questions come in, Katie, but couple of things. Obviously, just in terms of the polls that have been put up. First of all, I mean, I think it's clear from them in terms of understanding of devolved tax and the block grant. 50% had very little or neutral. And the best percentage, I guess, was 41% with only some knowledge. So it's clear that even amongst a fairly technical population, there's really not an awful lot of knowledge around how the devolved tax works and the block grant, etc. And the other poll was 74% didn't think that the Scottish Government does a good job of educating the Scottish public on Scottish taxes. Now, I think obviously one is hand in hand with the other there, but
Exactly.
I guess the question there is what can be done about that, and how important is it that the Scottish population really does understand the devolved tax system and the block grant?
I would say it's critical, and it's actually a legal duty of the Scottish Government to educate the public on this, and they do recognise that it is needed, and they do try to produce materials. But I would say that it's probably not done well enough. I would agree with our respondents, and so I think that without that education, without that public awareness, it really undermines accountability, because how else are we to assess the choices made by the government? How else are we to look at their tax policy choices and really understand whether they're making the best choice and how it's going to impact on those fundings? I think I've tried to illustrate with today's webinar that really tax and wider issues like public funding, healthcare, education, it all goes hand in hand, as well as with the economy, with the health of the economy. And so I think there needs to be an understanding and an education from Scottish Government as well on how all of those things work together, and what they're actually doing with those different elements, and what levers they plan to pull to maximise revenues, to fund the NHS, for example, because tax is one of those levers. But there are, as I think I've tried to illustrate, lots of different parts that go into what those tax revenues would be. It's not as simple as we'll just raise income tax by another couple of percentage points. We've got to look at the wider economy and the tax base and growth, etc.
That's great. And I think the other, as we mentioned at the top, I guess this was the last Scottish budget before the Scottish parliamentary elections in May. And I think, when you were going through some of the measures that were announced as part of the budget, there's a number of them are not going to come in until, or really take effect until the new parliament is elected. And I guess the question then is there a chance that some of those won't come into effect if there is a change in government? Or do you think, whatever the makeup of the new Scottish Parliament is, that most of those measures will just flow through?
An interesting question. So I do think that the majority of things will be passed. We'll have to wait and see. But there are some devolved taxes, like the building safety levy, the visitor levy. Those are all waiting at sort of the second stage reading. And the Scottish Government has said that they intend to have that fully passed before Parliament closes for the elections, which is sooner than we think. I think it's the end of March, actually, that they'll sort of shut down. So we'll have to see whether they'll accomplish that, but at the moment that's what they're saying. In terms of wider changes that could be made to the budget after a new government is elected, that is always a possibility. We have to wait and see what that new government may be. We may well continue with SNP government, majority government, and so it may just stay as the same. But there could be obviously changes if it were to be a different party that came into power. So I think I think I would say we'll have to wait and see what might happen going forward. But I wouldn't. This budget was a fairly quiet one. There wasn't too much that was particularly exciting. Maybe that's unkind of me to say, but I can't see that anybody would really have too much of an issue with a lot of those amendments, a lot of those announcements that were made at the budget.
Great, Katie. Thank you very much for your time. We're starting to run out of time now, but before I take a look at what's coming up, it would be great if you could just perhaps leave a rating for today's webinar. There'll be another poll just popping up on your screens shortly. We do really appreciate your feedback, and it does help us to assess what's the best format and content going forward. So do please complete that poll. In terms of looking ahead, what's coming up, if you haven't already done so, please sign up for our MTD series webinars in association with Sage. MTD is obviously the big thing that's coming up in the coming weeks. So Chris Downing is going to be with us over the next month or so, 6 weeks, to help us dive deeper into some of the problem areas which we're hearing about from members, and that includes looking at tools that you need to get ready, pricing strategy, and dealing with clients that can't or are resistant to the digital landscape. And on the 28th of January, you can join our cybersecurity partners, Mitigo, to look at the all-important topic of planning for that cyber breach that you hadn't planned for. Links to sign up for all of those ICAS events are available at icas.com/events. And for further information, guidance, and to keep up to date with the latest tax news, head across to the ICAS website. And if you need further support, then please get in touch either with the tax team or the practice support team through the ICAS Technical Help Desk, which can be accessed through the support section of the technical resources section on the website. It only leaves me to thank Katie for her expert insight, and of course you, the audience, for joining us on the webinar today. I do hope that it's been helpful to you, and until the next time, goodbye.